Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
Imagine sitting at the holiday table on a crisp Christmas Eve in our family's old Victorian house in suburban Ohio, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of roasting ham and fresh pine from the towering tree in the corner. Surrounded by relatives whose faces you recognize, but whose loyalties you question, and then your father, the man who raised you amid endless lectures on hard work and family duty, fixes you with a steely gaze right after grace and declares without a shred of remorse that you are not receiving a single penny from the family estate because your brothers have supposedly earned it all through their unwavering devotion, while you've been dismissed as the wandering daughter chasing shadows in the big city, leaving the room to freeze in stunned silence as forks hover midair and eyes dart toward you in a mix of pity and judgment, only for your young nephew, that bright-eyed 10-year-old boy glued to his smartphone like it's an extension of his curious soul, to shatter the tension moments later by jumping up and proclaiming at the top of his lungs that your name, Lacy Harper, appears on the Forbes list of billionaires, transforming the awkward hush into outright chaos as everyone swivels to stare at you with expressions shifting from disbelief to barely concealed greed, wondering how the overlooked middle child could harbor such a monumental secret that upends the entire evening's fragile peace, and what kind of reckoning might follow when the black sheep reveals herself as the one holding the golden fleece all along, because my story of quiet endurance and calculated silence is about to unfold in ways that will keep you questioning loyalties and the true cost of family bonds until the very end. That Christmas Eve unfolded like so many before it in our Harper household, a sprawling place filled with faded wallpaper and memories that clung like dust to the furniture, where my mother bustled in the kitchen preparing her signature pecan pie whose sweet aroma always promised warmth, but often delivered only superficial comfort amid the undercurrents of unresolved grudges, while my father, Harold, a retired factory foreman with calloused hands and a voice roughened by decades of barking orders, presided over the dining table like a king on a worn throne, flanked by my two older brothers, Mark and Jeff, who had molded their lives around his expectations by staying close to home and climbing the local corporate ladders in banking and law respectively, their wives exchanging knowing glances as the extended family, cousins, aunts, and uncles from nearby towns, settled into seats with plates laden with mashed potatoes, green beans simmered in bacon fat, and slices of golden-crusted bread that my Aunt Rita had brought from her bakery, the conversation flowing in fits and starts about neighborhood gossip, the latest high school football scores, and the relentless winter chill that had blanketed Ohio in a few inches of snow earlier that week, creating an illusion of holiday cheer that masked the deeper fractures I had long sensed, but chosen to navigate with careful detachment ever since leaving for college nearly 25 years prior. As the meal progressed and the clink of silverware against china provided a rhythmic backdrop to the chatter, my father suddenly set down his fork with deliberate slowness, clearing his throat in that familiar gravelly manner that signaled an announcement of weighty importance, drawing all attention to him as he surveyed the table with eyes that held the authority of a man who had always viewed his decisions as final edicts. And then he began speaking in measured tones about the family estate, the very foundation of our shared history, comprising the house we sat in, the adjacent plot of land where he had once dreamed of expanding into a small farm, and the modest savings accumulated over a lifetime of overtime shifts and frugal living, declaring that after much reflection he had decided to bequeath it all exclusively to Mark and Jeff because they had proven their loyalty by remaining in the area, supporting him through his retirement years, and building stable careers that reflected the values he had instilled in us children, whereas I, Lacy, the middle daughter who had ventured to Chicago a decade and a half ago to pursue opportunities in technology that he dismissed as frivolous distractions, would receive nothing at all since my absence had rendered me little more than a distant figure in family lore, unworthy of inheritance in his eyes because I had not sacrificed in the ways my brothers supposedly had. The impact of his words rippled through the room like a stone skipped across a frozen pond, cracking the veneer of festivity as my mother's hand trembled slightly while she reached for her water glass, her face a mask of quiet resignation honed from years of mediating such patriarchal proclamations, while Aunt Rita let out a soft intake of breath and Cousin Tim shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding my gaze as if the declaration had personally implicated him and my brothers, ever the beneficiaries of such favoritism, nodded with feigned solemnity, though their postures straightened with evident satisfaction. Mark's banker precision evident in the way he adjusted his tie and Jeff's legal mind already calculating the windfall's implications, yet I sat there amid the thickening silence, feeling the sting deep in my chest like a betrayal long anticipated, but no less painful for its predictability, choosing to respond with absolute stillness because experience had taught me that voicing protest against my father's unyielding judgments only invited further dismissal and ridicule, so instead I focused on the texture of the tablecloth under my fingers and the distant hum of the grandfather clock in the hallway, allowing the moment to pass without granting them the satisfaction of my reaction, even as the weight of exclusion pressed upon me like an invisible yoke. The uneasy truce held for a few agonizing minutes as conversations attempted to revive around topics as innocuous as the neighborhood's new holiday light display and the rising cost of heating bills during the season. But the atmosphere remained charged with unspoken accusations and the faint undercurrent of schadenfreude from those who had always viewed me as the outlier, the woman who had foregone the traditional path of marriage and local roots to chase ambitions in a male-dominated field. Until my nephew Tommy, that energetic boy with tousled brown hair and an insatiable curiosity fueled by endless scrolling on his device, who had been quietly picking at his food beside me while occasionally glancing up with innocent questions about my life in the city, suddenly bolted upright from his seat with his phone clutched triumphantly in his small hand, his voice piercing the din like a firecracker on the 4th of July as he announced to the entire gathering that he had just stumbled upon a breaking news alert on social media featuring me, his Aunt Lacy, listed among the Forbes magazine's newest billionaires in the technology sector, complete with a professional headshot and details about my cybersecurity firm's explosive growth that valued it at over $2 billion after a recent acquisition deal. In that instant, the room plunged into a profound hush broken only by the faint crackle of the fireplace logs in the adjacent living room, every face turning toward me in a synchronized wave of astonishment that bordered on accusation. My father's complexion draining to a pallid shade reminiscent of the snow outside, while my brother's expressions morphed from complacency to sharp suspicion, Mark leaning forward with narrowed eyes, as if demanding verification, and Jeff's mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, even my mother allowing a rare flicker of pride to cross her features before it dissolved into worry about the impending fallout, and Aunt Rita whispering to no one in particular about how such news must have been hidden for good reason, yet I maintained my composure, meeting their collective stare with a serene nod that acknowledged the truth without elaboration. Because in that charged moment I recognized the opportunity unfolding before me, a chance to let the revelation simmer and expose the hypocrisies that had defined our family dynamics for far too long, particularly when Mark, recovering his banker bravado, slammed his hand lightly on the table and demanded concrete proof of this alleged fortune, his tone laced with skepticism that hinted at deeper machinations he and Jeff might have plotted in advance to secure their unassailable claim, and as I prepared a measured response, I caught a subtle shift in my father's demeanor, not mere surprise but a calculated glint that suggested he harbored knowledge of my success long before Tommy's outburst, raising the unsettling question of what other secrets he had concealed to justify disinheriting the daughter who had quietly risen above the very neglect he had imposed. The stunned silence following Tommy's exuberant revelation about my Forbes listing stretched across the dining room like an elastic band pulled to its breaking point, with every family member frozen in their seats, as if the holiday decorations had suddenly come alive to enforce a collective pause. My father's calculated glint in his eyes betraying a depth of prior knowledge that made my pulse quicken amid the clatter of abandoned utensils and the faint scent of cooling pie still wafting from the kitchen, while Mark, my eldest brother with his perpetually furrowed brow from years of high-stakes financial dealings, broke the impasse by leaning across the table with an accusatory thrust of his hand, demanding irrefutable proof of this billionaire status that had upended his smug assurance of the inheritance windfall, his voice rising in a blend of skepticism and barely veiled outrage that echoed off the wood-paneled walls and drew uneasy murmurs from Aunt Rita and Cousin Tim, who shifted in their chairs as if the very foundation of the evening's proceedings had cracked beneath them, prompting me to respond not with defensiveness, but with a measured calm that I had cultivated through countless boardroom battles in Chicago. Offering a simple affirmation by pulling up the Forbes article on my own phone and sliding it toward him across the linen cloth, still dotted with crumbs from the meal, the screen glowing with my name, photograph, and the staggering valuation of Harper Secure. That had ballooned from a bootstrapped startup into a cybersecurity powerhouse serving everyone from small retailers to federal agencies over the past decade. As the article circulated like a hot potato among the relatives, passing from Mark's disbelieving grasp to Jeff's scrutinizing lawyer's eye, and even into my mother's tentative hands where her fingers trembled slightly upon recognizing the reality of my hidden achievements, the room erupted into a cacophony of overlapping questions and exclamations that blended shock with opportunistic curiosity, Aunt Rita exclaiming about how I must have been living like a queen in some high-rise overlooking Lake Michigan, while Cousin Tim joked awkwardly about finally getting that family reunion in the Bahamas. Yet beneath the superficial levity lurked the sharper edges of envy and resentment, particularly from my brothers, who exchanged loaded glances suggesting they had anticipated an unchallenged path to the estate and now viewed my success as an unwelcome interloper in their plans, leading Mark to press further with probing inquiries about the specifics of my business model and investment timelines, as if he were auditing a client rather than conversing with his sister. To which I deflected with a touch of humor drawn from the absurdities of my entrepreneurial journey by recounting how my first big break came not from silver spoons, but from debugging a neighbor's virus-riddled computer in exchange for a home-cooked meal that tasted suspiciously like the same green beans we had just eaten, eliciting a few genuine chuckles that momentarily eased the tension and reminded everyone that beneath the dollar signs lay the gritty determination of a woman who had clawed her way up without the safety nets my brothers had always enjoyed from our father's favoritism. The evening's fragile equilibrium began to fray further as the group migrated to the living room, where the Christmas tree lights cast flickering shadows across the faces gathered around the crackling fireplace. The air now thick with the scent of burning oak and the undercurrent of unresolved accusations that prompted Jeff to corner me near the mantel with a more insidious line of questioning about whether my wealth could retroactively contribute to family obligations, like the overdue maintenance on the estate's aging roof or the mounting medical bills Dad had hinted at earlier in the year, his tone cloaked in fraternal concern, but laced with the entitlement that had defined his legal career built on loopholes and leverage, making me inwardly bristle at the implication that my hard-earned fortune existed primarily as a bailout for their complacency. Yet I held my tongue on outright rebuke, choosing instead to steer the conversation toward lighter anecdotes about the quirky clients who had propelled my company forward, such as the eccentric baker whose online orders I secured from hackers in exchange for lifetime pie privileges. A story that drew reluctant smiles even from Mark and diffused the immediate pressure while planting seeds of doubt about their self-proclaimed sacrifices. Because in truth, I had been the invisible supporter for years, sending anonymous funds through third-party channels to cover property taxes and unexpected repairs without seeking acknowledgement. A quiet act of loyalty that contrasted sharply with their vocal demands now that the cat was out of the bag. As the night deepened and relatives began drifting toward coats and goodbyes amid hugs that felt more obligatory than heartfelt, my father pulled me aside into the dimly lit hallway where the grandfather clock ticked solemnly, like a metronome marking the passage of buried tensions. His face etched with lines deepened by whatever health concerns he had alluded to earlier, and his voice dropping to a confidential rumble as he confessed that the Forbes news had not entirely blindsided him since. Snippets of my progress had filtered back through mutual acquaintances over the years, though he had chosen to dismiss them as exaggerations to preserve his narrative of the dutiful sons versus the wayward daughter. But now with this public validation, he admitted a nagging worry about his recent checkup, revealing irregularities in his heart rhythm that the doctors wanted to investigate further with specialists in the coming weeks. A revelation that twisted my emotions into a knot of reluctant sympathy mingled with suspicion over whether this vulnerability was genuine or a strategic pivot to draw me back into the fold after his earlier disinheritance decree, leaving me to nod supportively while my mind raced with questions about the authenticity of his remorse and the potential leverage it might afford in reshaping family dynamics. Yet before I could probe deeper, he shuffled back toward the living room where the remaining guests lingered, and in a moment of solitude I wandered into his study, drawn by an inexplicable pull toward the desk cluttered with faded photographs and stacks of yellowed documents, my fingers brushing against a half-open drawer that revealed an old envelope postmarked from 2 decades ago addressed to my mother in Jeff's unmistakable scrawl. The visible snippet of text inside alluding to a concealed financial misstep from his early career that had nearly derailed the family's stability and prompted a cover-up to shield his reputation, igniting a spark of intrigue and betrayal that made me wonder just how many layers of deception underpin the estate Dad had so confidently allocated away from me, and what unraveling that thread might unleash upon us all in the uncertain days ahead. That old envelope from Jeff's past weighed on my mind like an anchor dragging through the murky waters of family history as I slipped it back into the drawer and rejoined the thinning crowd in the living room where the fire had died down to glowing embers casting long shadows that mirrored the doubts flickering in everyone's expressions after the Forbes bombshell, my mother bustling about with offers of leftover pie to mask her discomfort, while Aunt Rita lingered with sympathetic pats on my arm and whispers of congratulations that felt more like probes for details on my lavish lifestyle. Yet I deflected them all with vague smiles and stories of Chicago's relentless pace, because diving into the full truth right then would have unraveled the careful tapestry I had woven around my independence over the years. A tapestry born from the very neglect that had driven me away from this Ohio nest in the first place, where my father's favoritism toward the boys had always painted me as the afterthought, the daughter whose dreams of coding and innovation were brushed off as hobbies unfit for the serious business of inheritance and legacy. Reflecting on it later that night as I lay awake in the guest room listening to the wind rattle the frost-laced windows, my thoughts drifted back to the early days after college when I had packed my beat-up sedan with nothing but a laptop, a duffel of clothes, and a stubborn resolve to prove myself beyond the confines of suburban expectations, arriving in the Windy City with wide eyes and an entry-level job at a tech firm that paid just enough to cover rent in a shoebox apartment overlooking noisy alleys where the hum of ambulances and late-night arguments became my soundtrack to ambition. Those initial years a grind of double shifts debugging software for ungrateful clients who treated women in the field like novelties rather than experts. All while phone calls home to Mom revealed only surface-level updates to avoid Dad's scoffing dismissals about my foolish pursuits that contrasted sharply with the glowing reports of Mark's banking promotions and Jeff's law school accolades, fueling a quiet fire in me to channel that dismissal into fuel for late-night coding sessions that birthed the first prototype of what would become Harper Secure. A simple app designed to shield everyday users from digital threats inspired by a real-life scare when a friend's identity was stolen, leaving her destitute and humiliated. Much like the emotional theft I felt every holiday when Dad doled out praise unevenly, making me vow silently to build something unbreakable without ever seeking their validation or support. In the present morning after that tumultuous Christmas Eve, the house stirred to life with the aroma of brewing coffee and sizzling bacon as the family reconvened around the breakfast nook in a semblance of normalcy that belied the overnight scheming I could sense in the way Mark and Jeff huddled over their phones exchanging texts. With furrowed brows and sidelong glances my way, their whispers cutting off abruptly whenever I entered the room carrying plates or refilling mugs, a dynamic that escalated into open conflict when Jeff, emboldened by the remnants of his lawyer's bravado, launched into a monologue during the meal about the virtues of traditional family contributions and how my distant success paled against their hands-on efforts in maintaining the estate from leaky faucets to Dad's daily errands. positioning themselves as the unsung heroes deserving of the full inheritance, while implying my wealth was some fluke of timing rather than the result of relentless innovation. His words dripping with that light entitlement that made my blood simmer, but also sparked an opportunity for the subtle revenge I had been holding in reserve. So I leaned back in my chair with a casual sip of coffee and countered not with anger, but with a pointed anecdote drawn from my company's records about how anonymous transfers from my firm had quietly covered over $15,000 in property, taxes, and repairs for this very house in the last 5 years alone, all without a thank you or even awareness from the supposed stewards, watching with inward amusement as Jeff's face reddened like overripe tomatoes and Mark choked on his toast. The revelation landing like a well-aimed dart that punctured their boastful balloon and shifted the room's sympathy toward me for a fleeting, satisfying moment, though I knew it wouldn't end the brewing storm because their envy had roots too deep to uproot with one witty jab. The day's uneasy truce held through afternoon board games that devolved into competitive jabs and forced laughter, but as evening approached and snow began to flurry outside, blanketing the yard in fresh white, Dad summoned us adult children to his study for what he termed a clarifying discussion about the will's implications now that my financial standing had come to light. His posture slumped in the leather armchair amid shelves lined with dusty books and faded diplomas that chronicled his life's rigid achievements, his voice carrying a tremor as he reiterated the estate's allocation to the boys while conceding that my success might warrant a nominal gesture like a family heirloom or two. A half-measure that stung with its paternalistic condescension and made me bite back the urge to challenge him outright because part of me still clung to the hope of mending bridges without burning them entirely. A choice that might frustrate you watching this unfold, since restraint in the face of such bias often feels like self-sabotage, yet served as my strategic armor in navigating these waters. But then he paused with a heavy sigh and revealed a partial truth about the estate's origins tied to a long-buried investment from my mother's side that had been mismanaged decades ago, leading to ongoing liabilities he had shielded us from. His eyes avoiding mine as if holding back the fuller picture of how that mismanagement connected directly to Jeff's early indiscretions hinted at in the letter, leaving the air thick with incomplete confessions and the nagging sense that whatever bombshell he withheld could redefine not just the inheritance, but the very foundations of trust we had all pretended to uphold for so long. Dad's partial revelation about the estate's tangled roots in my mother's family investments lingered in the study, like smoke from a snuffed candle, swirling around us as he trailed off with vague promises of more details once the doctors cleared his schedule. His evasive gaze bouncing between the three of us siblings who sat in tense silence, absorbing the implication that our shared history held financial pitfalls far deeper than the surface-level favoritism he had always displayed, leaving me to wrestle inwardly with the frustration of his selective candor that painted him as both victim and architect of our divisions, while Mark and Jeff exchanged those conspiratorial nods suggesting they were already recalibrating their strategies to safeguard their portions against any ripple effects from this unearthed complication, a dynamic that made my choice to withhold immediate confrontation feel increasingly like a gamble where restraint might preserve some semblance of unity but risked enabling further manipulations, a path that could strike you as overly forgiving given the raw wound of his disinheritance speech the night before. Yet one I pursued because true leverage came not from explosive outbursts, but from the patient accumulation of truths that could dismantle their facades brick by brick without leaving me as the villain in the family narrative. The following morning brought a deceptive calm to the household as sunlight filtered through the lace curtains onto the breakfast table laden with stacks of pancakes and pots of steaming oatmeal that Mom prepared with mechanical efficiency to ward off the chill of unspoken resentments. But the undercurrents surged when Mark, ever the opportunist in his pressed shirt and calculated smile, proposed an impromptu family meeting right there in the sunroom overlooking the snow-dusted garden, framing it as a necessary step to address the will in light of new information, while his eyes flicked toward me with the subtle gleam of someone angling for concessions, prompting Jeff to chime in with supportive legalese about equitable adjustments that would honor Dad's original intent without complicating things unnecessarily. their tandem approach reeking of rehearsed entitlement that made my stomach twist in recognition of how they had always operated as a united front against my independence. So I agreed to the gathering not out of naivety, but as a stage for deploying a measured dose of revenge through the artful exposure of minor truths that would erode their moral high ground without escalating to all-out war. Settling into the wicker chairs amid the scent of pine needles from the nearby tree as Dad joined us looking friendlier than usual with his robe loosely tied and a mug of herbal tea in hand. The air thickening with anticipation as Mark opened with a recap of the estate's assets, including the house, land, and now this mysterious maternal inheritance he had somehow gleaned details about overnight, positioning it as a shared burden that demanded my financial input to stabilize rather than a revelation of past mismanagement. As the discussion heated up with Jeff sketching out hypothetical splits on a notepad that favored their historical contributions, while downplaying my decade of covert support, I interjected not with fury but with a wry recounting of a particularly telling episode from my company's ledgers where a routine audit uncovered that the anonymous donor covering the estate's escalating insurance premiums for the past 4 years had originated from my corporate foundation, a fact I illustrated by casually emailing a redacted summary to everyone's phones under the guise of transparency, watching with a suppressed smile as their screens lit up and expressions soured in tandem, Mark's jaw clenching like a vice on a faulty deal and Jeff stammering about misunderstandings in the records, the witty sting of the disclosure landing precisely because it highlighted their oblivious freeloading without requiring courtroom theatrics, a light jab that infused the room with uncomfortable laughter. From Mom, who had suspected my involvement all along and even drew a reluctant grunt of acknowledgement from Dad, though the victory felt bittersweet since it only amplified their defensiveness, leading Mark to pivot aggressively by suggesting we consult an independent appraiser for the estate's full valuation, including my newly disclosed assets, a move that carried the veiled threat of probing my empire for vulnerabilities they could exploit in some countersuit fantasy. The twist deepened the dilemma when Tommy, my pint-sized ally with his boundless energy and unfiltered loyalty, burst into the sunroom unannounced after eavesdropping from the hallway where he had been playing video games on his tablet. Clutching a printout from an online forum he had scoured out of sheer fascination with my story, the document outlining discrepancies in Jeff's early law firm dealings that matched the envelope's hints of financial sleight of hand 2 decades back, his innocent delivery of the information, Aunt Lacy, look what I found. It says Uncle Jeff helped with that old family thing Dad mentioned, turning the meeting into pandemonium as accusations flew and Jeff snatched the paper with a face paling to match the winter sky outside, forcing him into a sputtering defense that only fueled my suspicion about the depth of his deceptions. Yet I chose to de-escalate by praising Tommy's detective skills with a humorous aside about how he might run my security team someday, if he kept up the sleuthing, a deflection that bought time while aligning the kid firmly in my corner and making the brothers' glares sharpen with the realization that even the next generation saw through their posturing, complicating my internal conflict because while part of me relished the alliance, another wondered if involving him risked tainting his view of family forever. A choice that might seem short-sighted to you as the audience, since protecting the innocent often clashes with the pursuit of justice in these tangled webs. As the meeting dissolved into strained small talk and Dad retreated for a nap citing fatigue from the revelations, Mom pulled me into the kitchen for a hushed conversation where tears brimmed in her eyes as she confessed her long-held knowledge of my philanthropy toward the family coupled with her silence to avoid igniting Dad's prideful wrath, her plea for me to find a way to forgive and fix this before it's too late, tugging at the threads of my resolve and leaving me grappling with the emotional cost of revenge that could heal or further fracture us all, especially with Dad's health hanging in precarious balance. But the afternoon's fragile peace shattered when I overheard Mark and Jeff in the garage later that day huddled over a laptop with a financial advisor on speakerphone, their voices low but urgent as they discuss strategies to challenge my company's valuation through anonymous tips to regulators about potential antitrust issues in my recent acquisitions, a plot born of desperation to undermine my empire and reclaim their perceived dominance in the inheritance game. The discovery hitting me like a cold gust through the cracked door and propelling the conflict toward an inevitable confrontation where the full weight of their betrayal would demand a response far beyond subtle jabs. Overhearing Mark and Jeff's clandestine plotting in the garage against my company's foundations sent a chill deeper than the swirling snow outside, propelling me back to the warmth of the house where I paced the hallway wrestling with the dual impulses of confrontation and calculation that had defined my approach to this family fiasco from the start. Their scheme to sic regulators on my acquisitions, reeking of the same short-sighted greed that had torpedoed Jeff's early ventures and now threatened to drag the entire estate drama into a public spectacle far uglier than any holiday argument, making me question once again if my persistent restraint in the face of their provocations was a mark of strength or a fool's tolerance that invited endless encroachments. A stance that might leave you shaking your head in disbelief, since swallowing such betrayals often seems like inviting the wolf to dinner, yet had always served me well in boardrooms where patience outmaneuvered bluster. So I resolved to turn their aggression into the noose for their own necks by gathering irrefutable evidence of their machinations through a discreet call to my legal team, who confirmed the advisor's identity and the flimsiness of their antitrust whispers, arming me with the leverage needed for a climactic showdown that would expose not just their pettiness, but the rotten core of the family secrets Dad had half unveiled the day before. The confrontation ignited that very evening as the family reconvened around the dinner table for a meal of hearty stew and cornbread that Mom ladled out with forced smiles to bridge the widening chasms, the air heavy with the scent of simmering onions and the unspoken dread of impending revelations. But I wasted no time in laying my cards on the table by activating the speaker on my phone to play a snippet of the recorded garage conversation. Nothing invasive, just enough to capture their voices, scheming about leveling the playing field through anonymous complaints to federal watchdogs. The audio crackling through the room like thunder rolling in from the plains and freezing everyone in place, with Mark's distinctive drawl and Jeff's hedging justifications echoing off the walls, prompting Dad to drop his spoon with a clatter that reverberated like the final nail in their coffin, while Mom's eyes widened in a mix of horror and vindication, and I followed the shock with my ultimate clever revenge by revealing not anger, but a comprehensive dossier emailed to the table outlining how my foundation had underwritten over $100,000 in family debts, including Dad's experimental treatments and the estate's structural overhauls, for the past 7 years, all documented in black and white ledgers that transformed me from the disowned outsider to the unwitting benefactor whose generosity they had squandered in pursuit of exclusion. The witty precision of the exposure hitting home because it forced them to confront their hypocrisy without a single raised voice from me, watching as Mark's face crumpled into excuses about desperate measures and Jeff buried his head in his hands, muttering about youthful mistakes finally catching up. A satisfying unraveling that infused the stew steam with a cathartic bitterness long overdue. Twists cascaded from there as Dad, spurred by the audio's betrayal, finally disgorged the complete truth about the estate's maternal legacy in a voice hoarse with decades of suppressed regret, explaining how my grandmother's patent for an early encryption method, buried in obscurity after a bad partnership, had inadvertently seeded the technology underpinning Harper Secure when I rediscovered similar concepts during my startup phase, a serendipitous inheritance he had concealed to prevent infighting that instead festered into the favoritism that sidelined me, while Jeff, cornered by the moment, confessed the envelope's contents detailing his embezzlement of $10,000 from the family trust in his rookie lawyer days to cover gambling debts, a crime Dad had covered up with stern lectures and repayments that never fully restored the trust. The admissions weaving a web of interconnected deceptions that made Mark's own envy-fueled plots seem like pale echoes and left Mom in quiet sobs over the lies she had enabled to keep the peace, emotions churning through me in waves of anger at their choices, mingled with a reluctant pity for the flawed humans who had shaped my drive. A complex brew that prompted me to make one final choice you might disagree with profoundly by offering not total cutoff, but a structured path forward where I would fund Dad's full medical care and estate preservation on the condition that Mark and Jeff commit to 6 months of probationary work at my Chicago headquarters handling entry-level cybersecurity training, earning their shares through sweat rather than entitlement, my words delivered with a humorous twist about trading briefcases for boot camp. That elicited a choked laugh from Tommy, who had snuck in to witness the spectacle, the deal hanging in the balance as they grumbled but ultimately nodded in defeat. The power inversion complete yet laced with the uncertainty of whether such enforced humility could forge genuine change or merely breed resentment. As the night wound down with tentative embraces amid the dying fire's glow and the snow piling higher against the windows like unanswered queries, I gathered my things for the drive back to the city, reflecting on the whirlwind that had upended our Christmas into a reckoning of buried truths and fragile redemptions. Dad's health still a precarious thread in the tapestry, my brother's transformations and proven experiments in accountability, and the family bonds stretched but not severed, leaving me to ponder if my revenge through revelation had truly liberated us or simply illuminated the cracks too wide to mend. A thought-provoking haze settling over the highway ahead, where the taillights blurred into questions about forgiveness's true price and whether silence's roar could echo into lasting harmony or fade into the whiteout of old wounds. The ambiguity lingering like the last notes of a half-sung carol that invites you to supply your own ending in the quiet aftermath.